and welcome back to these videos about the Norman Conquest. In these first series of videos we're looking at Anglo-Saxon England, and this is the third video in this series. The first one looked at the nature and diversity of Anglo-Saxon society. Last video looked at Anglo-Saxon religion, and in this video I'd like to talk about Anglo-Saxon culture. And I'd really like to look at the question, what can cultural artefacts tell us about the Anglo-Saxons? But let's start off with something a bit simpler. First of all, what do we mean by culture? And culture is one of those big words that can mean quite a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I am focusing in on this definition here. The ideas, the customs, the social behaviour, the traditions of a particular people or a particular society. So what I want to look at are the ideas, the customs, the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. And to do that, we're going to look at a series of artefacts. Before we get there, I'd like to look at a quote from a historian, because it's important when we look at the Normans that we look at what historians think. And Michael Wood, who's one of the greatest historians about the Anglo-Saxons, says this: "It was a time of violence and cruelty, a hierarchical society where most people were poor and or unfree, with slaves comprising maybe 20% of the population. And yet, you can see the huge effort men and women made to try and build just societies, to transmit culture and learning, and to create beauty. And all of it was done in loyalty to the past and to dream of a Christian civilization." And Wood's quote there is something that I want to unpack today, because I think in the previous videos we've talked about some of the real problems with Anglo-Saxon England. The fact that its religion was quite odd and in some ways quite corrupt. We talked about society that was very strict with a lot of slaves. And yet, as Michael Wood says here in this quote, they created great beauty. And I want to show you that with 6 objects. Here we go. So the first object I'd like to introduce you to is the Alfred Jewel. And the Alfred Jewel is quite small. It's really only kind of maybe as long as maybe one of your fingers. And this object here would have sat on the end of a stick, and it would be used to read the Bible or to read prayers and to show where you were on that line. It's a thing though of great beauty. It's made of gold. In the middle, there is a depiction of Christ made from precious stones. And then round the edge of it, you can even just about see the word Alfred there. And this jewel was made by, we think, Alfred the Great, who sent these to different parts of the kingdom to show his power. And this object shows how cultured these people were. These were craftspeople. They knew how to make absolutely beautiful objects from stones and metals that came from across Europe. They had links with vast amounts of different societies. They were learned. They were also deeply religious. The Fuller Brooch gives a very similar impression. And this brooch was made of silver and would have been quite like a size of a big badge that you would wear on your cloak or your coat. And the Fuller Brooch again shows the craftsmanship of these people. In it you can see depicted again a religious kind of, maybe an angelic figure in the middle, and around it you can see lots of different pictures. You can see those Celtic influences in terms of their religion coming in here. And again, you can see the intricacy, the craftsmanship of these people. And this is why some historians think it's not fair to call this period the Dark Ages, because the Dark Ages name implies these people were stupid, were uneducated, and were unskilled. This object shows something very, very different. And it's not just in pieces of art or pieces of jewellery that you can see the education of the Anglo-Saxons. You can also see it in literature and in books. And one of the most famous pieces of literature that comes from the Anglo-Saxon period is the story of Beowulf. And Beowulf was a poem that was told at the time about a hero, Beowulf, you can see him here, bearded, and how Beowulf had to fight the monster Grendel. And this poem is vast and includes dragons and sword fighting and saving damsels in distress. And it shows again those ideas of those pagan ideas being important to the Anglo-Saxons, but it also shows how cultured and how literature was a key part of their society, that they had time to produce these poems that are beautiful and have lasted the ages of time. And it wasn't just poems that they wrote or pieces of fiction, they also wrote vast histories. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is an example of this. A chronicle is something where you write down what happens each year, not in a kind of diary, but in kind of you write down really the events of the year. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is vast, and there are quite a number of surviving copies of this. And really they were written histories of England, and it shows that these people are obsessed with the past and knowing where they came from. They're interested in history, and also how beautiful these pieces of work are. They're illustrated with these great kind of beautiful illustrations. You can see this bee here, and you can see the beautiful handwriting that was made. And they were also interested in things that were quite bizarre. And one of the books that was quite bizarre for the Anglo-Saxons was a book called The Marvels of the East. And in this book tells you about really the world beyond Europe. So the Anglo-Saxons didn't travel much beyond Europe. Some people did, but very few people from Europe did at this point. And this book really tells them about what they thought was happening in the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, they thought there were kind of odd monsters and different people, including this very odd man on the right who seemingly has no neck and has quite weird genitalia. Now, you could see from this, again, those ideas that these people are trying to work out the world around them. And okay, they've got it completely wrong. And you can see some of those pagan ideas coming in. But they thought deeply about the world around them. And they wanted to communicate those ideas to everybody as well. And lastly, the other thing that you can see of great example really of Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship is their architecture. There were few stone buildings at this time, but they started really in the Anglo-Saxon era. And this one example here, which is St. Peter's Church in Barton upon Humber, is an example of Anglo-Saxon architecture. It's quite blunt, it's quite bold, it's often quite square shapes, Anglo-Saxon architecture, but again, shows that these people are trying to really emphasize their religious ideas in their buildings, and also shows that they were able to produce buildings that are really quite beautiful for the time and quite vast for the time. So this brings us back to the question that's run through all of these videos about whether Anglo-Saxon England was a golden age. Was it a golden age? And I want to leave you with this question, and I want you to think about this of, does the Anglo-Saxon culture that we've looked at here support or challenge the view that Anglo-Saxon England was a golden age? And we're going to come back to that in the last video next.